Have you been forgiven?
Yes, amen.
Amen. Have you been forgiven? One test really to know whether we've truly been forgiven is do you easily forgive other people? In the Lord's Prayer, as Michael read earlier, it says the words, forgive us our debts as we forgive others. And there's something, when someone hurts us, when someone wrongs us, we recognise that it does actually hurt. It can be very, very painful. And it's not always easy to forgive, to let go of that person because they've inflicted some pain upon us. It's not always that easy to let go, to let them off the hook, as it were. In fact, some people, you may be one of them, can hold grudges against people, bitterness, unforgiveness for years, if not decades, if not the whole of their life. Sometimes people take these things to the grave because they don't know about forgiveness. But what about when we wrong someone else? What does it look like for us? When we wrong someone else, how do we treat those things? Yeah. Did you come and sit and be quiet? You can do, yeah. Yeah.
If you listen.
Yeah. So sit down here. So we're talking about forgiveness, yeah. Talking about forgiveness. So when someone hurts us, it can be very, very difficult sometimes to let go, and sometimes people have grudges for years. But when we hurt someone else, often we do the exact opposite. We're trying to downplay the pain, the wrong that we've done to someone, and try and make excuses like, I didn't mean it, or I was having a bad day, or you don't understand what I'm going through, or just sort of minimise it and try and say, well, it wasn't actually that bad what I've done to the other person. So our take when we do about wrong things is that we tend to run down, minimise the things that we do wrong, but when someone else does something wrong against us, we tend to elevate it and hold on to it and see it as a much bigger thing. So God's take on it is, as we read in chapter 6 of Matthew's Gospel, this is God's take. Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. So we need to be forgiven, and we need to extend that same forgiveness to other people. So that brings in the question about justice and forgiveness. Peter comes up to Jesus, as we read, if you want to look on the sheet here. Verse 21 on the sheet says, Peter came up to Jesus and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times. So he's wanting to know, if someone hurts you, how many times they come up and say sorry, they hurt you, you say sorry, how many times will you let them off the hook? And Peter's coming and he suggests 7 times. Now apparently that would have been seen as quite a lot, because the teaching of the day, the rabbis, the Jewish religious leaders, would have said you would forgive someone up to 3 times and then that's it. Don't forgive them anymore. So Peter's thinking that he's been over spiritual in a sense, saying, well, shall I just keep continuing forgiving up to 7 times? And Jesus comes back and he says, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. So there's something there about 70 times 7. There's something there about the 7 is about completeness, perfection. Jesus in a way is saying that the heart that I want you to have, if you want to be right before God, is that you've got a heart that forgives people every single time. Because that's the heart that God has towards us. What he was doing was counteracting people being vindictive. That sense of like, if you hurt me, then I'm going to hurt you. That sense of revenge. That sense of what you say to someone is that if you've hurt me, then you deserve to be punished. You deserve to have some retribution. And I think, often we think about justice. The Moors murderers, very infamous around here. When I first came up here quite a while ago, this was 40 years after the event. And there in the Tameside Advertiser, you looked at it, and there was Keith Bennett's mother appealing to Ian Brady that she might tell him tell her where the remains of a 12-year-old son was because he'd died. And you could just read in the article, you could feel this woman's pain. A 12-year-old son's been snatched from her. She doesn't know where he was. She knows that he's been murdered. She can't even pay the respects to bury him properly. Quite often, her face would appear in the Tameside Advertiser. You could just feel that sense of justice, that this man has wronged me and he needs to be punished. And that's quite right. You know, God's a just God. When we do wrong against God, He will punish us. That's what, you know, we all cry out for that sense of justice, that sense to see justice. But how can you balance justice with mercy? How is it that we can be merciful to the people and forgive? What we need to understand is how much God has forgiven us. We just read a story here about someone going to a king and they owed a huge amount of money and they're begging for forgiveness, yeah? So this is a picture for us about how much we need to be forgiven by God. It says in verse 23, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants." So it's a picture really of Judgment Day. The king is God. One day we'll all have to stand before God and we'll have to give an account. So the question is really, is how big is our debt? It says verse 24, "When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents." Right, just to try and work out 10,000 talents, how much money that was. So a talent was worth about 20 years' wages, yeah, for a labourer. So say 10,000 talents, that's 200,000 years worth of wages, yeah? You think of how much money that is. So let's say the person earned £15,000 a year. That's a debt of £3 billion. Now then, unless you're friends with like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos,
My dad's Elon Musk.
is it? Yeah. Then you've got no hope of paying it off. But it also, in the language of it, it's written in Greek, but 10,000 was the highest number in Greek arithmetic. It was like a sort of an extreme, really. So in a sense, what Jesus is saying is that our debt isn't just £3 billion worth, the sins that we've done which have offended God, but it's an infinite amount. And we're just drowning in the interest of that debt every single day, just like we'd be drowning in a huge financial debt. So how does God see our lives? How do we build up this debt? Right, well, we think about things that you do wrong. So you can break the law. There's laws in the land. You break the law, that's obviously something that's wrong. It'll be accounted there, and you've got to account for it on the day of judgment. There's things that you might do in secret that you know are wrong, and you're ashamed, so you don't want anyone else to see it. Those things will be revealed and counted against you. But then when you start to think about some of the things that most people don't see as bad, so things in like God's commandment, it talks about honouring your father and your mother, obeying your mum and dad. Every time we disobey our parents, those things will be counted against us. Every time we covet, which means you're looking at something jealously and thinking, I want that, I'm going to do whatever to get that. It's something in your heart. Then those things will be held against us. Even our very thoughts will be exposed on Judgment Day. Yeah? All those things, and when you start to think it in those lines, you realise that the debt that we've got against God is building up daily. Every single day, those sins that we do against God is building up. But one day we'll have to stand before Him and give an account. And will He declare us guilty, or will He declare us innocent? The big question is have you been forgiven? We all need to be forgiven. Have you been forgiven? If you haven't been forgiven, then justice kicks in. Just like the murderer who rips away a 12-year-old from their family, they deserve to be imprisoned. They deserve that justice is served. They deserve to be punished. But our debts deserve to be punished likewise. So our sin against God deserves to be punished, and if we're not forgiven by God, then we'll have to pay those debts out in hell itself. And when you think about someone who perhaps murders and they might go down for 20 years, they might pay the debt, but then they come out and they re-offend and they perhaps go down for even longer next time. There's no escape from hell, because every time we're in there, people keep sinning every single day in there, cursing God and living for their own desires. So there's no escape. So how can we be forgiven? Have a look at verse 26 and 27. The servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me and I'll pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. This man wanted to try and pay his debts off. There's no way he could do that. There's only one man who can win forgiveness for us, and that's Jesus. He went to the cross, he took our sin upon himself, but we have to come in faith and to believe upon him. So how do we know if we've been forgiven or not? Right, so the question is have you been forgiven? And one of the tests is if you have been forgiven, you can forgive other people. It says in verse 28, when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, "Pay what you owe." So we talked about the huge debt that this man owed, but 100 denarii is about 100 days' wages.
Yeah, I want to stay. Sorry.
Yeah? So it's not an insignificant thing. When someone does something wrong against us, it can be hurtful, it can be painful. Yeah, it can rest with us for a long, long time. So it's not an easy thing to forgive someone. But the point is that if you can't forgive someone when they've done such a small thing to you, when you realise how much God's forgiven you, then you've not really understood how much God has forgiven you. When you understand that God's forgiven you all your sin, it's then possible when someone does something wrong against you for you to forgive them. So the question again is, have you been forgiven?